Today I'm joined by David M. Malone, Rector of the United Nations University, to discuss a new book which he has co-edited entitled International Development, Ideas, Experience and Prospects. Thank you very much for joining us today, David.
Thanks.
So as a co-editor of this book, could you tell us a little bit about it, including the main topics covered and the people involved?
Thank you. Well, Nancy, the book came about because in the institution I was privileged to work for before coming to UNU, Canada's International Development Research Centre, a book had appeared on IDRC's institutional history perhaps 5 years ago. It was a very accomplished book of institutional history by two Canadian historians. But a number of us thought that to complement that, and perhaps even more interesting than the institution, might be to work on a book that looked at the key ideas that had driven development efforts since the 1950s and how these ideas interacted with experience on the ground. Obviously, they help generate the experience on the ground in terms of development efforts, but how the results of experience on the ground fed back into the level of ideas. So it was this feedback loop that some of us were particularly interested in. Many people think development is primarily about programming and policies, but before you have programming and policies, you have ideas. We tend to forget the level of ideas because often those who trade in ideas make them very abstract and use vocabulary that's scary. So people tune out. Mention theory to anybody and people rush screaming for the exits. If you mention ideas to them, that sounds a lot more friendly. And theory and ideas are close cousins.
Great, thank you. What is your background with the subject matter of this book?
Well, as a boy, my parents went to live in Iran, a wonderful country, which at the time was undergoing a particular sort of development policy. The ruler of the country, the Shah of Iran, had gone into exile in the early 1950s at the invitation, or at least under pressure, from his parliament. He was restored to power by the agency of the British and the Americans, but he was smart enough on return to realize that he hadn't been a big success until then, and that he needed a project. And having cast about for advice from international experts, some of his own advisors, the project he came up with was an accelerated forced march towards Western-style modernization for his country. That would seem improbable to us today, but interestingly, in 1962, when my family went to live in Iran, I was 8 years old, Iran was considered the poster child for international development efforts. Aspects of the program were very attractive to us, particularly in the West. A lot of it centered on the emancipation of women, on ramping up education, including for girls, objectives that we all would have thought were excellent ideas. Indeed, everybody seemed to think they were excellent ideas. The experts were more or less unanimous. Now, the experts were mostly economists, but there was unanimity that Iran was on the right track. There were exceptions. A small group of Iranian and French sociologists and anthropologists publishing in obscure journals nobody read kept saying that actually Iranian society was under great stress, that these reforms were moving way quicker than the comfort level of much of the population would allow, that particularly in rural areas, very traditional areas of the country, and in the poorer slum areas of the rapidly expanding cities, with many people recently arrived from rural areas, all of this was too much too fast. They were comprehensively ignored. A few months after my parents arrived in Iran, about 6 months after they arrived, there were some very violent riots. They were fomented by clerics in the holy city of Qom, particularly a cleric we would hear much more from later, Ayatollah Khomeini. And they targeted symbols of this forced march towards modernization, Western-style modernization, particularly women in professional positions, bank tellers, people like that. Many of them died in these riots. But again, such is the power of groupthink, unfortunately, that the riots were dismissed as an epiphenomenon, something that was not systemically important, something we needed to pay no attention to whatsoever, a bump in the road. Actually, they were, of course, precursors of the happiness to the unhappiness that would well up within Iran, and that within the next 15 years would see the Shah exiled again from Iran for a second and final time. Because this particular project, beloved of the experts, beloved of economists, beloved of development types more widely, but ignoring Iran's society, its makeup, what its values were, failed altogether. Many people would rather not remember this today. I find it instructive to remember it, as I happen to live in that country I love for 5 years, and have always been distressed that something well-intentioned ended so badly. So that was one formative experience in development. Later, I worked on development in Sudan for my country, Canada, overseeing Canada's aid project there in the program there in the late 1970s. We had a number of projects which all seemed sensible projects, building roads, supporting dryland agriculture, helping with forestry inventories, all of them practical things that we thought needed doing and that the government of Sudan told us were helpful. When I returned to Sudan 25 years later, there was no trace of any of them. It seems that they had had very, very little local uptake. Perhaps because in much of Sudan, the population is pastoralist. What matters is cattle. And cattle don't need roads, they need tracks. Forests may not be the first thing in the life of cattle. And dryland farming, very worthy, but again, if your stock in trade is raising cattle, dryland farming may be somewhat beside the point for you. So that might be one explanation, but doubtless there were others. So it's a field in which bright ideas and good intentions jostle with the reality on the ground, with local values, what local societies want. When we think of development, we tend to think of economies. How's the economy doing? But actually, societies are at least as important as economies in determining the fate of countries, of groups of people, social forms of organization. And that was largely lost early on in development and is still very much a minority preoccupation within the development field. So bringing together my experiences in Sudan and in Iran and a number of others over the years, I was very interested in this interaction between ideas, practice on the ground, do we learn anything from this, and what is our thinking today about all of it?
Great, thank you. Can you describe your motivations and those of your co-editors behind this book and how the project originated?
Well, the project originated slowly, like most ambitious projects, and in conversations between individuals. Also conversations eventually between three of us and our publisher, Oxford University Press. Peer review is tremendously important and valuable. When we had an outline of what was to become this project, Oxford University Press sent it on for peer review, and we got back a number of really useful comments. And one of them led us to ask a fourth person to join the group of editors, Ravi Kanbur of Cornell University, who turned out to be a fabulous colleague. So there were three people based in Canada, Ravi Kanbur at Cornell, but our objective from the outset was to have a majority of our authors in the developing world. After all, development is their project. We are outsiders in many ways to that project. Secondly, we wanted to make sure that we would slice and dice development and its ideas and experience on the ground in a number of different ways. And so, of course, the book looks at a number of key issues. How was development theorized, and how has that theorization changed? What can development economics tell us about development, and how has development economics changed? It's changed a lot. But also in the developing world, what has really mattered? Gender issues have really mattered. Education has really mattered. Agriculture has really mattered. All these sectoral issues have mattered a great deal, but so have the ways that societies organize themselves and groups within society. Which groups turned out to be important? Which ones militated for change? How did governments react? How did governments organize themselves for development? Were international organizations helpful or unhelpful? Probably a bit of both. And so we wanted it to be a very open volume. We didn't have a point of view at the outset, except that we wanted to cast our net very wide, particularly in terms of authors, and also have a mix of authors who were young and old, famous and not yet famous. We wanted people from different ideological persuasions as well. So our aim was to create a very rich volume, and then also to make sure that the fruit of all this work wouldn't just be incorporated in the book. It's a wonderful book, and we're very grateful to Oxford University Press, and we hope lots of people buy it. But we also wanted to have a rich website, which would make the text of the book not in page-proofed form, but in pre-publication form, available to anybody who's interested anywhere in the world, to add elements that would make the book and the material easier to use in teaching, primarily university-level teaching, and all of that can be found on the website, which is a very elegant one as well as, I hope, a useful one, and it can be found at www.developmentideas.info. So developmentideas.info. And I hope many people go to it. There's much too much material for anybody to want to read. It's something that people will dip into, will take parts out of. If you're somebody teaching development studies or some aspect of development studies, you could perhaps adopt a dozen of the chapters for a class over a term and see how that works with students. See whether the questions we raise are the right ones. They may not be. So it also opens itself, we hope, to all sorts of experiments.
Great, thank you. So what are your goals for this project and how would you like to see it evolve over time?
Well, for a couple of years, we're going to keep the website very live, have it be a center for dialogue on development through blogs, through all sorts of interventions, have it be altogether interactive for a couple of years. Websites are expensive if you keep them up, so you can't promise to do it forever. But while a conversation gets engaged, we hope all around the world amongst people who may be interested, we wanted to be in a position to support that. And we're very grateful that that has been possible. We're grateful to our authors to be excited about this, to be willing themselves to be interactive in the 2 years to come. And our conversation today is a little element of that much wider picture.
Every book brings new lessons for the readers, but also for the authors and the editors. Could you tell us what you learned whilst working on this project?
Well, first of all, who you work with matters tremendously. It really helps if you like them, because every project goes through difficult periods where authors are late with their drafts, where some of the drafts are disappointing while others are fabulous, where the grind of trying to make sure that the project as a whole is cohesive, coherent, and above all enriches the field is a hard grind. It helps to have authors that you admire and like. It helps to have co-editors that you admire and like. We had a tremendously supportive editor at Oxford University Press. This helped greatly. So that is important. Working with people you dislike for one reason or another on intellectual projects is very, very different. Working with people who are curious, who are interested in learning from each other, who aren't just interested in burrowing down deep in their own patch of what is a very wide field, but who are tremendously interested in what other people think and in what other patches of this very wide field reveal at any given time. So that's very important as well. Diversity, I mentioned, of age, background, experience, interests amongst the editors as well as the authors, but also creating a conversation amongst the authors. We were fortunate to be able to bring our authors together 3 times in different formats, in different parts of the world, and with different outside participants as well. The book has a foreword by Amartya Sen, a very generous one. He joined us for one of our conversations just outside New York. I think these conversations helped our own ideas evolve. So it wasn't just about producing a book. That's easy enough to do. It was about trying to move the field forward a bit and bring scholars together across generations, across subdisciplines within the field of development. I hope it was successful for many of them. For me, it was truly thrilling because I learned a lot, and ultimately, that's what I always try to do in my work. I'm happy if I'm learning something. If I'm learning nothing, I feel I'm wasting my time.
Thank you. Is there anything else at all that you'd like me to ask?
No, simply that we're very proud that as a matter of happenstance, this project has migrated in part to the United Nations University. It was started elsewhere. I'm delighted that UNU is participating. UNU has several institutes that are leading actors in discussions on development economics, for example. WIDER, the World Institute of Development Economics Research, headquartered in Helsinki, has been doing wonderful work for 30 years now, challenging orthodoxy in the field of development economics. A slightly more recent institute, Merit in Maastricht, developed a new field, the economics of innovation, primarily in the developing world. So UNU has been at the field for many years, So we feel privileged now to be part of a consortium of institutions that serve as the institutional backbone for the next 2 years of dialogue amongst many constituents that we hope the website and the book, or the website or the book, will reach.
Great. David, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.